Well, good morning. I first got the idea for this sermon from an event described in the memoir Small Fry by Lisa Brennan Jobs. She is the daughter of Apple Computer co-founder Steve Jobs. They had a very fraught relationship, with him barely acknowledging that she was his daughter and refusing to admit that one of the earliest Apple computers, the Lisa, was named after her. Early in the book, she describes a dinner her family had in a restaurant when Lisa's cousin Sarah was joining them. Now, Steve Jobs had very strong views on everything, including what food other people ought to put in their bodies. But they had forgotten to tell Sarah about that. "I'll have the hamburger," she said, too loud. When the food arrived, Jobs glanced at the hamburger with disgust. And this wasn't Sarah's only perceived transgression. The awkward teenager also talked too loud and too high in pitch, and she stooped when she stood. After she had taken a few bites, Jobs blurted out, "What's wrong with you? No, really, you can't even talk? You can't even eat? You're eating crap. Have you ever thought about how awful your voice is? Please stop talking in that awful voice. I wish I wasn't here with you. I don't want to spend another moment of my life with you. Get yourself together. Pull yourself together. You really should consider what's wrong with yourself and try to fix it." Oh my God. What a total jerk. You don't say this kind of thing to anyone, much less an early adolescent girl. There are boundless stories of Steve Jobs' cruelty. Clearly, he had never heeded his own advice to consider what's wrong with yourself and try to fix it. Doctor, heal thyself. Perhaps because the scene is so horrific, it stuck in my mind for a long time. And I started wondering what it means these days to take stock of oneself and work to better those things that aren't optimal. There is no end to all the self-help books out there. Just a quick Google search brought up hundreds of titles. There are classics like How to Win Friends and Influence People, or The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. There are cheerleading books like You Are a Badass and Awaken the Giant Within. A newer kind of self-help book promises big rewards from small things like Atomic Habits, Tiny Changes, Remarkable Results. Or Make Your Bed, Little Things that can change your life and maybe the world. Or The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And then there are books that defy categorization, like Stay Sexy and Don't Get Murdered, the definitive how-to guide. And then finally, there are some self-help books that promise things that are demonstrably impossible, such as The Everyday Email Eradication Plan, How to Get Your Inbox Down to Zero and Keep It That Way in 6 Easy Steps. And that's not just 6 easy steps, that's 6 easy steps with an exclamation point. We had a conversation about this, unbeknownst to Dave, who was talking about the disarray of his email inbox before the service started. You didn't know I was going to mention this one. But almost all these self-help books purport to teach us a skill of some kind, how to do something better. They don't address how to be better. That is, how to really be a better person. What I'm talking about takes us into the realm of moral character. There aren't nearly as many books about that because, of course, that is much more difficult work and it takes much longer, despite Benjamin Franklin's idea that he could do it in a year. The idea of working on oneself over the course of many years, even up to a lifetime, is pretty foreign to most people. Dancers like our lay leader Robin are certainly familiar with the practice, as are professional musicians like me. We spend decades patiently perfecting technical and artistic skills. Athletes also spend a lot of time developing their skills. But doing long-term work on moral character seems to have gone out of fashion. Benjamin Franklin's plan would not have seemed so out of place in the 18th century. Yes, today there's occasional talk of character development programs in public schools, but that seems to always get lost in the drive for measurable things like better test scores. But how often do adults really stop to assess their moral character and make a plan to improve? Especially when a predominant message these days is that we are all perfect the way we are. So be honest, have you ever taken stock of your moral character? You don't have to answer out loud. But I did go through this process myself to some degree in preparing this sermon. I started by listing some things that I knew I had to work on. I quickly realized that a bunch of the items on my list had to do with talking. For instance, item 1, complain less. In this regard, I aspire to emulate my mother, who rarely complains about anything. I don't think I walk around all day complaining, but yeah, there's room for improvement. Item 2, I need to speak less at faculty meetings. 3, I need to ask more about other people in conversations and talk less about myself. My role model here is my pal Robin Collin again, who has a wonderful knack for turning the conversation towards other people. Next, I also need to interrupt people less. Then there were mundane things like helping more in the kitchen and with chores around the house. But to be honest, this wasn't a very satisfying list. Sure, all of the items are worthwhile goals, but they didn't get to the core of moral character. I could never work on fixing any of these negative traits and still be a reasonably good moral human being. I did, however, identify a few things that have greater gravity. A tendency toward classism. Growing up in Southern California, almost all the people I interacted with on a daily basis were middle class or higher, and almost all from suburban areas. But in Potsdam, I encountered a class with which I was unfamiliar, the rural poor. And I was uncomfortable with it, I am not proud to say. It was the kind of discomfort that middle class people feel when directly confronted with poverty that they can no longer ignore. And let's be honest, the town and gown gap is great in Potsdam and Canton. But sometimes fate puts us exactly where we need to be, and living in the North Country has forced me to face this latent bias. Another item that I listed that needs improvement is greater tolerance for people who make grammar and punctuation mistakes when speaking. This too is a class issue of educational level, but it's also a race issue. For instance, Black Americans often say ax instead of ask. But as my daughter explained to me one night when she called me out on this very issue, who truly has the right to determine the rules of grammar and how people express themselves? Those who would enforce such rules are often exercising control and power from a position of privilege. Speaking of race, we've all learned in the last 2 years how we need to examine ourselves for unconscious racism. So that made my list too. Finally, there were a few other miscellaneous items that I wanted to improve. Punctuality, for instance. Nah, just kidding. Some virtues are a lost cause. But even with these weightier issues, I was still dissatisfied with my list. Too many items were the kind of small local things that could be fixed by reading one of those self-help books I mentioned. I needed to look at the bigger global picture of things that all human beings everywhere should strive for. So I looked for lists of virtues espoused by the world's religions. And in doing so, I felt that I was finally on the right track. They gave me the big, broad categories that I was looking for. In Christianity, there were the 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. By the way, these were actually derived, I found out, from Plato, although Plato added piety to that list. Also in Christianity is a different list of the 7 heavenly virtues: chastity, temperance, again, charity, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. Then there are the 4 Brahma Vihara of Buddhism: loving kindness, which is the wish that all beings, without any exception, be happy; compassion, the wish for all beings to be free from suffering; empathetic joy, the feeling of joy because others are happy; equanimity, not to distinguish between friend, enemy, or stranger, but to regard every being as equal. One of the lists of virtues that I liked the most was from Zoroastrianism. First one, follow the threefold path of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. 2, practice charity to spread happiness. 3, the spiritual equality of all. And 4, being good for the sake of goodness without the hope of reward. That last one is I think a particularly good one. I also checked out the steps to Islamic self-purification, but to be honest, I did not find those as adaptable to Unitarian Universalist sensibilities. But did you notice some of the recurring themes in these lists of virtues? As it turns out, old Ben Franklin did a pretty good job of distilling and consolidating the ones he found in religion and philosophy when he developed his list. But that was his list, and I needed to create my own. So I started with Franklin's list, pared it down, and then added a few more essential virtues that I thought he overlooked. I'll walk you through my thought process on each point of his original virtues. Number 1, temperance. I've seen firsthand how alcohol and substance abuse can destroy lives, so I think this is important. But I also think it can be consolidated with moderation below, so I did not keep this one. Silence. Well, given that some of the things I need to work on have to do with speech, I kept this virtue but changed the term to the Zoroastrian good speech. 3, order. Well, I don't believe that keeping an orderly desk or room makes you a better human being, so I cut this one out of there. 4, resolution. Okay, having resolution is helpful, but again, it doesn't necessarily make you a better person, so bye-bye. Frugality, same as the previous 2, it's gone. 6, industry. Like resolution, it's helpful, but not fundamental to our moral character. 7, sincerity. I do think this virtue is important, so I kept it. The world is too full of those who speak things that they don't really mean for reasons of power and manipulation. So sincerity is actually critical in our human interactions. 8, justice. Anyone who has been wronged can attest to the primary importance of this virtue. 9, moderation. I kept this one because it's broad enough to cover alcohol and substance abuse, but can also cover things like sexual overindulgence. 10, cleanliness. This is a remnant of Christian cleanliness is next to godliness, mostly used to get children to bathe and clean their rooms. But you can be dirty and still have moral character, so it's not on my list. 11, tranquility. I struggled with this one. While tranquility is certainly something to strive for, it is not a virtue in and of itself. On the other hand, tranquil people have an easier time living up to the other virtues, so maybe it should stay on the list, but in the end, I left it off. Number 12, chastity. This one's right out. Besides, moderation takes care of overindulgence. On the other hand, Franklin says that it's okay to pursue sexual pleasure for reasons of health. So if you want to keep this one on your personal list, you have a pretty big loophole. 13, humility. This is a big one. Without it, it is unlikely that one would ever take stock of their moral character in the first place. Without it, it's hard to see all human beings as true equals. There are some virtues missing from Benjamin Franklin's list. In fact, some of the omissions are quite shocking by our 21st century perspective. Where are compassion, empathy, and kindness? Those three are at the very top of my virtues list, and they hardly need explanation or justification. And finally, I also added gratitude, charity, and patience. And that's Doug Rubio's list of virtues. It turns out that I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. The sages of all time had already done most of the work for me. If we aspire to work on our moral character, then these are the things that we should strive for when we work on ourselves. Now, to be honest, I don't yet have a grand and detailed plan like Benjamin Franklin's, where I work on one virtue a week and carry around a little book in which I mark each of my transgressions. Well, now I think about it, maybe that's a billion-dollar idea for an iPhone app. But to paraphrase Franklin, I do feel that I am, by the endeavor, a better man than I otherwise should have been had I not gone through the process.